You're watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, Rob Watson here, and this is the 9th Decentered Media Talk, in which I'm running through a series of ideas and a set of ideas and concepts to do with community media and how we maybe can get our head around what the idea of community media is or can be. And I'm just kind of going to talk today about the idea of identity and, in a way, how we have a socially constructed identity and how that is played out in community media. It's part of an ongoing conversation and discussion, so there's lots of prompts and there's many other layers to this that we can talk about in the future and that we can work through. But this is really a kind of a focus on getting the conversation started. As ever, sorry, as soon as I've started speaking, I've started coughing. As ever, notes are available with the video, and copies of the slides will be made available as well. So let's share the screen and let's start to think through some of the kind of main notions of what we think of as identity. So there's a kind of common cultural understanding or critical understanding that identity is something which is formed within the context of a matrix, if you like, of different cultural factors, which means that we maybe aren't we aren't the generators of our own identity, but we fit in with other activities and patterns of behavior and concepts and ideas and activities that are taking place in society, rather than, if you like, ourselves having a sense of identity. And I think we can maybe think about this, and it's a concept maybe we can draw on later, is actually what's the difference between character and who we are, if you like, as genuine individuals, and then also what do we think of as our persona, which is that thing that we kind of project into the public world. So this is a kind of moving kind of set of issues in terms of coming to a view about what our identity is and whether we should consider ourselves to be, how relevant is a sense of identity and what purpose and what function does it serve. But it's typically, we think, a constructivist view of identity is one that says that, our identity is developed in the context of kind of values and norms, social values and social norms, which we inherit, which are part of our collective culture, but also they're a sense of practices and a sense of labels almost, or ascribed characteristics might be a better way of formulating a way of thinking about this, but that they work and exist in a context which is defined by power relationships and structures. And there's the emphasis that is placed on those things, those power relationships and structures, is something which is hotly debated and contested at the moment in what is talked about as the culture wars. So that our sense of how and in what way we have an identity is something which is not straightforward, and there's no easy answer as to, there's no consensus at the moment about how our sense of identity is fixed or brought about. And I think what we want to think about here, though, is the role that media plays in helping to foster or create the environment in which our identity is enabled. So, have some water. So we've got two. Well, we've got more than two, but there are two to start off with. Approaches to thinking about identity, and one is the essentialist approach and one is the relationist approach. So the essentialist approach would ask and suggest that we have something which is essential to our identity, and that it's kind of an independent expression of something who we are, which can be seen across time and across space, that defines each of us as unique individuals, and our identity is stable and it is founded in a sense of a true essence, if you like. Whereas the relationist approach actually is, the other side of this, which says that we're actually our identity is fluid and that it's contingent, so it's temporary, and it's suited to the needs of the situation that we are in, and that there's a mutual dependence is a way of thinking about what our identity is, and it doesn't have any, if you like, grounding in anything that is timeless. It's something which is of the now, of the moment, and it changes. And I think there's a fair degree of this thinking which is valid, because it doesn't seem that it doesn't feel that our identity is something which is consistent as we live it through town, because people put different expectations on us at different stages of our lives, and we have different capabilities at different stages of our lives, and we have different capabilities given our resources. So these things can change and can be fluid, but that doesn't mean to say that, it's when you strip all of those things away, what are you left with? The danger is with the relationist approach is that you're just left with an empty husk and there's nothing there. Everything can be ransacked about our identity, just discarded. It can be reinvented continually, but there's no core, there's no meaningful core there. The problem with the essentialist approach is that you kind of say that, well, you're fixed with this and you can't ever change. I oscillate between the two because common experience is something in which we express our sense of self. Postmodern experience says that we can create versions of ourselves and that we just kind of dress up in different outfits, and we can perform a sense of identity. But how does that undermine our sense of sustainability and rootedness? Because if everything is just kind of floating around and we're able to adopt whatever kind of form of expression of our identity that we wish to put on at that particular moment, then we might not be rooted in anything. And it's a good question to ask, what makes somebody essentially, I don't know, let's put it like this: what makes somebody essentially Jewish or essentially Hindu or essentially Christian? Is that possible to say that, or is it merely that those people have adopted an affectation which can be discarded easily? You can see how this can get into quite thorny problems about inclusion and exclusion because of our perceptions, our modern Western perceptions that essentialist issues about identity are secondary, and that it is merely a kind of a game that we play. So there's a kind of useful kind of set of criteria, if you like, that we think about our differences in the context of, and that we identify our identity in the context of the differences. So, what is our civil and social and political identity? What is our biological race identity? Do those distinctions matter? What is our symbolic ethnicity model of identity? What's our symbolic gender model of identity? What's our biological sex model of identity? Do we have a class identity? How is this structured within the social world? What's called the habitus, the place where relationships, social, economic, political, cultural relationships are exchanged and interact. And how are these expressed in our culture through things like language and creative output in terms of media content, and the practices? And then there's the, kind of how is this wrapped into place and the sense of belonging? So a lot of the time, I think identity is considered from one side, which is as being a set of facts. And on the other side, it's considered as being a set of processes. And so if you take the facts-based view, it's, you identify a list of characteristics and you look at where people are meet the characteristics of those facts, and it accumulates as a series of facts, and therefore you are X, Y, or Z. But from a human perspective, for the people in that process who may wish to reject that ascription of identity based on those so-called facts, it might be easier to consider, or better to consider, that identity is the formation of a process, and a process which is brought about through expression and motivation and a sense of identification. And so we're in this position of thinking identity isn't really something which is, it's more like a constellation, if you like. If you think of a constellation of stars forming into a pattern, which is temporary, but which is guided by and defined by various processes like the gravitational attraction, if you like, the interaction of light. Now, there's these processes happening and taking place, which, from our perspective, from another person's perspective, looks as if they may be a set of facts and criteria, but looks can be deceiving. Looks don't give you an indication of what the inner process is about. And looks don't give you an idea of what is symbolically defined by a sense of identity. They only tell you what is outwardly expressed. And then, so to be fair to people, we have to kind of put ourselves in a position where we can understand that what's called intersubjectivity, that kind of ability to imagine and attempt to understand where somebody else is coming from in terms of their conscious ideas, their expression of their identity. And that's quite a difficult thing to deal with. And the postmodern problem of everything just being floating signs and signifiers in a sea of signs isn't helpful, because it's kind of like, the Matrix movie is a good example where you can just adopt and readopt new personas based on your ego desires, but that only, I think, as Carl Jung has rightly identified, the ego can very quickly become quite a tyranny, and that it doesn't necessarily satisfy the rest of our sense of being. If we only ever project out, we feel like we should project outwards a sense of a socially acceptable form of identity. And if we repress and hold back other elements of our identity, then we are in a situation where our antagonistic social situation. So this kind of is played out, if you like, in modern Western society, a kind of an anxiety about what expressions of identity are, and we have an expectation that our social and cultural realm should be homogenous, and that there should be a blending and a mixing of all of the different interreactive identities. around, sometimes around spatial identity, but sometimes around cultural identity. And I like what Zygmunt Bauman talks about in terms of, but our multiple identities at any one time are playing out, and that the postmodern dilemma is that we have a number of different identities. I think it's the thing about Erving Goffman talked about the expression of identity as that it changes according to the social context in which we're interacting. So we have a sense of an expression of identity which is suited to our family, or a sense of expression of identity which is suited to being in the workplace, or being in education, or being with our friends. And on each occasion, those masks that we wear, that persona that we adopt, is different. But then at the same time, we have a sense that is, kind of our identity is something that we call upon in times of stress and difficulty and rapid change, and being able to call on a belief and an assurance that our identity is that something that supports who we are and where we wish to go is very important. And we do a lot to support people in order to make sure that that sense of identification is not solely compartmentalized or ghettoized, but that it actually forms part of a wider spread of integrated identity. Multicultural integration is one element of this, but there are concerns that cultural, economic, social segregation is gathering pace in the UK, and this is seen around things like issues around to do with housing and jobs and access to education. And the divide between, kind of the rich and the poor, that kind of thing, it pulls and stretches the sense of commonality, regardless of the sense of religious or social identification. The economic identification plays a major part in meaning that society can move forward sustainably. So community media then has a role to play in articulating and balancing some of these ideas and some of these relationships. And it tends to do this in the context of the kind of lived experience of the people who are taking part in the community media project. So rather than focusing on stereotypes and assumptions about people, when community media is produced effectively, it draws on the lived experience that people share of what they've experienced, either being drawn from a cohesive, homogenous, secure community, or their experience of being part of a diaspora, a community that's spread away, that's moved away from its home place, if you like. The modern, postmodern dilemma about international capitalism is that you can kind of travel around anywhere and be anyone and go and mix and integrate with other cultures. And but at some point there's a kind of, you look at videos on YouTube with people talking about the expat experience when they're in. I was watching one the other day about people being who've moved to Thailand, getting jaded and not integrating with the Thai culture, and they kind of moved to Thailand and set up as they have all the same. They aim to have all the same amenities and facilities at the same level and the same standard that they would have had back in the UK or the USA. And what they find is that that doesn't bring any kind of happiness. It doesn't mean that you fit in. If all you're doing is sitting, this is the way it was expressed in this video, is all you're doing is sitting in your air-conditioned condo and occasionally going out to get a meal or to get some food messages, and then it doesn't really mean that you're interacting with the culture that you're now living within. So that kind of isolation and segregation of modern media kind of has a really strong role in keeping people at home, watching umpteen channels and streaming services to so that you don't have to go out and mix with other people. And it's what Zygmunt Bauman said, is that people have become mixophobic, and that's when social anxiety is amplified, and we become distrustful of one another. And that's kind of one of the, if you like, the overriding conditions about our social cohesion, is that we have become increasingly distrustful, and that we need to use our media in a way which breaks down those barriers and facilitates trust building. And I think community media has the potential to play that role. But that's tied in with things like kind of technological change and the forms and practices and institutions that facilitate interaction between people. So we're not so good at investing in open, accessible, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-faith public spaces other than shopping. Seems to me to be the main priority. Kind of it's if you ask many people what our cities are about, our city centres and town centres are about these days, it's about the shops that are there, and that's the great equalizer. But there are a few other activities, such as, I don't know, adult education or theatre or art or whatever that might be, that help to define the relationships based around place. But also now tied in with the kind of communication technologies that facilitate this as well. So we also live in an age where diversity of identity has become very kind of fascinating, I suppose, and we can spend sociologically we can spend many hours trying to observe the nuances between different groups. And if we look at kind of fashion and youth fashion, is a real treasure trove of expression of cultural identity and people who are trying to develop a mode of almost ritualistic expression through fashion and clothes that say something about the kind of culture that they are part of or are pushing to explore new parameters for. And it's not easy, because we long gone are the days when, for example, pre the teenager, when you went from childhood to adult culture and there was no transition phase in between. Now it's really difficult to identify who the adults and who the children are, or the adolescents are. There's no distinction often between adults and adolescents. Many people have held themselves in this very extended expression of adolescence, which can extend now, well into your middle age, and that you still, the preoccupations that you had through childhood are still dominant in what you do. Your obsession with fantasy films or fashion, those kind of things. Previously, there was there wasn't the clear. There was more of a clear delineation between the two. So our idea of self-expression as a form of presenting our identity is something that has become very lucrative. It's there's a huge market that drives this now, and fashion is something which is kind of drives consumption, and that expression and that statement, and it's phrases, be the best version of you, that kind of thing, which kind of actually in the context of a lot of the kind of hyper fashion that takes place and the quick fashion and the kind of the immediacy and the kind of constant it's not to say that there's not pushback against these models of fashion. There are people who are anti-fashion in their adopted styles and personas, and that's maybe an area which I kind of maybe been drawn to myself in the past. So it's kind of, it's finding how that expression of identity is developed. And let's watch a short clip from the music video for Brimful of Asher Corner Shop. Oh. Sorry. Couldn't see the play button.
Behind movie scenes, behind the movie scenes, Sadirani, she's the one that keeps the dream alive, from the morning past the evening to the end of the life. Brimful of Asher on the 45, well, it's a brimful of Asher on the 45. Brimful of Asher on the 45, well, it's a brimful of Asher on the 45. And singing, illuminate the main streets and the cinema aisles. We don't care about no government warning about the promotion of the simple life and the dams they're building. Brimful of Asher on the 45, well, it's a brimful of Asher on the 45. Brimful of Asher on the 45, well, it's a brimful of Asher on the 45.
So that's kind of an exploration of pop culture and a reflection and a reinterpretation of the expression of pop culture through music, through films, through arts, kind of as the anchor point for our identity. It's kind of not who you are, but it's what you participate in through popular culture, and that's an incredibly strong, idea that developed a lot of significance in the second half of the 20th century and through to now, and it's only been accelerated with the rise of the internet and things like that. But I think what's really important with this is it goes further than just playing the records, if you like, is that there's an embodiment that comes from an identification with pop culture and popular music, which isn't just neutral, if you like, isn't just a happy place where everybody goes in and buys and shops and wears bright coloured clothes and things like that. There's actually a point where a distinction, I think, where people draw lines and distinction points and say, no, we're on one side and you're on the other side, and we are different. But this is a line that we're drawing in our culture, which is also part of an embodiment of our identity as social beings. So our gender, our race, our ethnicity, those kind of factors, which is tied in with the expression of culture. So there's a lot, it's interesting. Occasionally you see flare-ups in the press of controversies about people cultural appropriation. Well, you've missed the point of what pop culture is. If you're worried about cultural appropriation, the point of pop culture is cultural appropriation. You're trying things on, and you're trying things on from different cultures. But there is debate about authenticity in pop culture. So if somebody is playing, for example, reggae, but they happen to be a white male, is that a less authentic expression of reggae than if it was a Caribbean male, for example? And so that's a very interesting kind of dynamic there, to say that you essentialize expressions of culture because they're rooted in identities that go beyond simply that culture. It's it's to watch the debates around who can use certain words to describe a cultural expression and a cultural identity. And I'm not saying I have a strong view about how and where things should fit, but I'm interested in the fact that we have that debate and discussion anyway, because it is part of an expression. That's what's interesting about post 20th century cultural ideas, is that the expression of identity is something which is kind of, it flips around a lot, and it's kind of understood for different reasons. Let's watch a clip from the People's History of Pop.
Up in Coventry, a new musical movement burst onto the scene that was hoping to unite the kids and, instead of fighting in the streets, get everyone dancing together. The Specials fused ska from the 60s, punk rock, and a mod look, all into one genre, named after their label, Two Tone.
The first album I bought was this one, The Specials debut. I've been saving up for weeks, held together by Scotch tape now, you know. It struck a chord with me because the original ska, which I'd heard growing up, also struck a chord with me, but this was different. It was like the next thing is to emulate the look. This is me at the age of 15, you know, dressed in the style, you know, with my Crombie on. I used to sometimes carry the albums to school. They were like badges of honour. I've been into punk, but stopped short of adopting the look, you know. I liked reggae, but, you know, couldn't locks my hair up. But this definitely felt like this was something that I could relate to. The funny thing with Two Tone is that, as upbeat as it was, when you actually read the lyrics, they're talking about serious issues. So I zoomed in on that, but I liked the fact that they were a mixed band. It just made it like, this is something that, you know, your white mates as well as your black mates can relate to.
So there's that sense of cultural, intercultural engagement, which at the time, the kind of 70s and 80s in the UK was kind of pushing boundaries, if you like, but it was facilitated by an idea that, you know, an inherent idea within pop music, that pop music is transgressive and can displace boundaries. But not all cultural expressions are about transgressing boundaries. Many cultural expressions of identity are about facilitating, if you like, a more fixed view, a permanent view of an expression of identity, one which would hopefully endure. But as was kind of expressed through that clip, then, was that it's about the values that are being driven, and the rejection at that period of the inherited values that was expressed through the music, which kind of identified that, you know, there should be a moving on from the what was used to be expressed as the mother culture, if you like, the culture that people inherited but didn't want to project into the future. So one of the challenges with identity is this notion of a sense of belonging. And it's kind of there's a good way of thinking about it in terms of, you know, the kind of factors which define our sense of belonging. Or how much are they wrapped up in a sense of place? How much are they wrapped up in a sense of our head identity, our ego, our persona that we want to project? How much are down to the values, the things that we care about in our heart, and how much of them are expressed in a kind of embodied way through our hands and physicality, if you like, our dancing. And you could also add, I think, to this a kind of sense of what's missing from this is the sense of time, of past, present, and future as well. We could add that as an additional dynamic within this, because the immediacy of a sense of identity, which is based around what we are embodied to express. One, if we don't express that, it becomes kind of locked, and it becomes just, if we repress that, that becomes a problem. But also it's fleeting, and if it's of the moment, so those people dancing at a music concert or a nightclub, it's very much of that moment. How does that endure? Well, one of the things through popular culture is that you make artifacts, records, and you play them, and if you own a copy, and you take great pride in having the physical copy. Now, we're living in a digital world now where that is, again, it's moving away. You don't have that sense of identity based around the record collection or the magazine collection or the the posters that you put on your wall. And that's it's of how much that will change our sense of identity, because it becomes something which is kind of a curated digital archive. I kind of don't think it's something that you can show to other people in the same way. You can't bring your friends around to your bedroom to listen to your music collection, because you can just share it with them as a playlist on iTunes or Spotify. And that's, when you're in that youthful period of forming your identity, that's quite crucial. And it might be an issue. My experience with men and guys is record collections and being a DJ and sharing those physical objects and swapping and that kind of thing is incredibly valuable. It's very ritualistic. So it's Michael Ignatieff puts it. It's we live in a period of instability, and our security, our sense of belonging, is something which is now precarious. And it's not just precarious because we have economic precariousness, and our job security isn't as solidly foundational as it was in the past, but also that there's a kind of a psychological insecurity, because it's harder and harder to justify having the artifacts of our culture which demonstrate that we have a sense of belonging. And the virtues that are extolled in the popular media are things like kind of stripping away all the clutter in your life, and giving things, not having things and just having digital versions of them, and not having so much stuff. And it's like, and we shouldn't consume unnecessarily. And I agree with that in terms of the disposability. But then, what about the permanence? If your book collection is just on Kindle, how is that preserved for future generations? Unless I'm a Luddite and not understanding the nature of the leap that we've taken into the digital age. So the question I suppose we should ask ourselves is, where do we belong? And when we're thinking about identification through our programming for community media and our writing for community media, that we ask these questions, not just of other people, but of ourselves as well. What's unique about our place, our time, our race, our religion, our gender, our sexuality, our the community identification that we have assumed is who we are, our class, our age, and in many ways, there's a kind of a dialing up and a dialing down of the volume on many of these things. I think one of the things about contemporary theory is that it kind of sees these things as an intersection. Well, I kind of prefer to see them as an embodiment of something which comes from the individual, not the other way around, not an intersection of powers, if you like. It's it's like the it's like the social field theory model is, kind of, we are units of meaning, and we have to traverse the landscape. And if you think of that in terms of, like, I don't know, the electronic fields or the magnetic fields of a place, and each of these things interact with one another in a way which, our age matters more matters in many ways as it interacts with other things. So this idea of a process is that our sense of belonging is generated from a dynamic process of these things happening and going on and occurring, and really, in a way, our job is to understand this process, but also at the same time is to recognize, I think, that we can't just, it's pointless to go around and try and reinvent yourself. And the modern way is to externalize this. The postmodern way is to externalize this and represent yourself. The trick is, and I think Schopenhauer is the person who talked about this. The trick is to understand what your character is. You are born with a unique identification, a genus, which is who we are defined as. And whatever form of expression and engagement that might take, our character is something which comes through, and we retain and travels through with us through our lives. And that's not something that's particularly taught well these days, about understanding the nature of character. And although it is important, and it's we have to make distinctions and judgments on the basis of what we regard as the hierarchy of values when we're assessing characters. Our political leaders, for example, what are their virtues in public office and public life? How much of this is known to us, and how will people change? Well, I think people don't change, but what they do is they accommodate the nature of their character, and that they mitigate against some of the extremes of their character. And that's by default the idea of a process of socialization. But what's important for community media is the stories that we tell about this. I don't see this as a negative. I think I see this as an opening up, as something which gives us the opportunity to put ourselves forward into the world confidently and positively, is that there is a story to be told. You have your character, we have our characters, and we should embrace our futures on the basis that we actually have something which is of value. I'm very humanistic in that sense. I'm quite an optimist in that way as well. I'm not driven by ideas of angst, existential angst, or nihilism, as the postmodern condition might lead to. But I'm actually, maybe not hesitantly, should we say, a believer that there is something that each of us can express, and that is of value, and that we not just have a right to do that, but we have a duty to express what that might be in different ways, to the point where it doesn't impact and affect other people negatively. We have a responsibility to ensure that the expression of our sense of self is accountable to others. So we're interacting mutually with other people in that expression of identity. So we do this through our stories of belonging, which are kind of set of conversations that indicate a way in which our development is directed. These stories and conversations are there for a purpose, and I suppose this is the underlying principles of what maybe literature is, and kind of the canon, what's called the canon, which is the kind of the books that are included that tell us something about ourselves. And I'm all for changing and evolving the canon, but we can never just reject the canon of the past. We have to come to an accommodation with that and build something new. And to do that, we need to, if you like, have a conversation, a discourse between the wider cultural repertoire, the things that go on in our culture, and ourselves. So we occupy this thing, which is a very subjective position. We call it, the subject position. And within that, we've got rights and obligations, but we've also got a sense of, we are negotiating this with other people, and change is inevitable. A culture that doesn't change atrophies and dies. But on what basis are we taking this forward? So is this dynamic, kind of discussion, deliberation, expression, movement? It isn't something. This is it isn't something that's fixed, but nor is it free from the weight of what works, if you like. So it's always a process that's open to change, based on ideas that serve us well, if it's done properly. But many of us now live in a world which is diasporic, which is intercultural, which is mixed. There are, certainly here in Leicester, the culture is of many people, 70 different languages spoken at least in this city. And so it's the dynamic nature of that intercultural expression is something which can't be fixed quite easily, and needs to be managed and nurtured in an intelligent way, on the basis that there are issues to do around with the cultural context, the kind of way in which we understand that this kind of dynamic identity is formed, the relationship with host and homeland cultures and beliefs and ideas, and that we kind of see this in a way as a kind of an emergent space that is opening up, but we're conscious of it, and that we are engaged in the process of conversation and discussion about it, rather than merely holding on to the things that gave us certainty in the past. And we have the spaces in which we can facilitate those people who can, pull from the ether, if you like, pull from the spirits, if you like, something which, the artists, the writers, the poets, the music makers, who can coalesce something which tells us what kind of direction we're going into. So this is part of the cultural negotiation process, which then gets turned into a political negotiation. And that idea of being spread and distributed around the world is something which is new for postmodern culture, and is something which is emerging into metamodern culture. So we've got to be mindful of things like transnational flows of identity, and these have always happened. The Britons are an amalgam of French, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Roman. There's all sorts of precedent identities, genetic identities, that inform what modern Britain is about. And maybe we've seen an acceleration of immigration to the UK in the last 50 years. But that kind of doesn't give you a guide rule as to what you can do in the future. But it does give you a sense that, these things do happen, and it is part of the human process for migration to happen, to occur, and that we need to think about ways in which we can manage our resources in the world properly, that don't produce enforced reactive migration, but that there's a sense of social enablement through a migration and intermixing, which is for a positive reason rather than merely for to address negative problems like war, famine, mass unemployment, those kind of things, climate change now. So we're going to have to invest in our understanding and our ability to deal with this, because this kind of reimagination of a sense of belonging, we've discovered through the pandemic, I think, that the communications needs of people living in modern Britain, it's certainly in cities, are not homogenous, and that you may be a resident in a place like Leicester, but you may never use any local media, which talks about any kind of local infrastructure, culture, politics, anything that goes on in your local neighborhood, because the majority of your media consumption, which can keep you entertained for many hours, comes from around the world. And there's a great benefit from that. I certainly enjoy being able to consume media from around the world on things like Netflix and YouTube and stuff. It's opened the world up to me, but at the same time, it's made me realize the kind of paucity of experience, commonality of experience that we have in a place like Leicester in terms of what is our common culture. How do we belong in a particular neighborhood or a particular town or a particular place, which isn't just a kind of regurgitated marketing spin expression of identity. And again, I think this is a really strong potential role for community media to try to define what the common social interests are. And that, we are bound by in some degrees by our common political, social, and cultural interests, and it's expressed via kind of ethnic personas and language and culture. But what are the common links that unify us and allow us to create a shared sense of experienced identity rather than mediated identity? I think it's a crucial idea, is that we live in a world which is, we identify who we are through what is mediated and how we are mediated, not necessarily in terms of what we express and what we experience. And so I think the push back towards common activities of experience, rituals, places where we really invest in the common ground, the common wealth, the common place, the social realm, where we can have an expectation of a bringing together of different identities in a place, which is embodied in that place, rather than it merely being something which is a kind of expression of consumer wants and expressions in the marketplace. Organisations like the BBC spend an awful lot of time, money, and expertise on trying to make sure that they are up to date with and kind of leading inclusion in media representation. And to some extent, I'm kind of torn between the idea that that's a good thing and that might be a bad thing, because on the one hand, what it means is you have to put a lot of technical management things in place, which grind creativity to a halt. And I think structurally, something like the BBC maybe needs to be reorganized in order to be able to, rather than just grafting people of minority identities into the BBC, actually rebuild the structure of the BBC so that it incorporates minority expressions of identity, and that they're seen as being a part of the natural process, rather than something which management consultants have to kind of coax through a fairly transactional model of internal and external engagement. But this is a live issue, which quite rightly is of a hot topic, and so it should be, and we should hold our mainstream broadcasters to account. A good example of is I was reading about this in the Kevin Howley book, and it's the Hobo News model, which is that to think about what the power of what a well-formed media artifact can do, a community media artifact can do. It's the hobo news model, which is bringing people together around the idea that this disparate group of people in the United States, we use the expression tramps, in America it's hobos, who wandered around the country and travelled about and didn't have a fixed abode, and homeless basically. And some of it was enforced, some of it was through choice. But there was a kind of a bringing people together around a collective identity of the hobo as being something which was you could bring together and look at. There was a recognition of the culture of the hobo, which meant that people could be defined and define themselves as clearly recognizable, a clearly recognized social group. And if you think that was kind of fanciful from, kind of the 19th, early 20th century, then the relevance to today in the UK through things like The Big Issue is really important.
Roll up, the big issue. Big issue there, ladies, gentlemen. Big issue. Help the homeless.
Would you like to buy a big issue, sir?
Big issue, please, big issue.
Over the last 20 years, in cities across the UK, thousands of homeless and vulnerably accommodated people have taken the opportunity to earn a legitimate income.
Take your time, never know what mate. See you later, lovely.
The Big Issue magazine is one of Britain's leading social businesses and exists to help the most needy in society on their journey away from homelessness.
The Big Issue, they gave me my life back. I had no life before I came to The Big Issue, and then when I got badged up, they gave me a second chance in life.
The magazine is a hand up, not a handout, and helps those going through the trauma of homelessness to take control of their lives by turning them into a micro-enterprise.
You've got to help yourself before you'll really get help. That's the way I feel.
Big issue, ladies, big issue.
You're giving them something for their money. You're not just taking their money from them.
Every week, they sell an entertainment and current affairs magazine, which they buy for £1 and sell to the public for £2. They learn to manage their sales, control their finances, and rebuild their confidence and self-esteem. These skills are crucial in helping homeless people reintegrate into mainstream society.
The way I look at it, just because I'm homeless doesn't mean to say I can't work, and that's what the Big Issue is about, and it makes me feel good about myself.
A Big Issue vendor is someone who has taken the first step to rebuilding their lives.
So that sense of identity that comes through from identification with a media product is unique, and something that we should encourage more and facilitate more, I think. So it's kind of the distinction about this. This is what I like about this idea that Raymond Williams talks about, a knowable community. The vast majority of us are part of a knowable community, but there are unknowable. Are there unknowable communities out there, or is the breakdown of community beyond? Is there something beyond that noble sense of community, that noble sense of identity? What exists outside of that? That's a really important question. It doesn't mean to say that nothing exists outside of that. We have to go and find out and look for what that is and investigate and represent and talk about that. And I think that's what community media kind of reaches for, if you like. I mean, there's a lot of people I'm a pathfinder by temperament in my my psychological type, and the idea that we can move away from the base camp and what we know and explore beyond that known world, that interests me. Whether it's an inner journey or an outer journey, it's that exploration is fascinating, and our community, our model of community, is something which we stick to. The community, our identity within that community is safe, secure, fixed, rigid. But it isn't like that for everybody, and it doesn't have to be like that for anybody.
Every now and then one comes along and you just know they have it in them to be sober.
I used to smile and I used to dream.
I think this is his last shot.
I had high hopes about the man that I could be.
No word from your dad?
I'm kind of solo these days. Hey, Dad, do you remember Hillary? Hi.
Yeah, we're late, darling.
We're just chatting about Christmas.
Unfortunately, our table's full.
I rode my luck and my luck ran out.
I want to be clean. I want to live a life.
You can't do it on your own.
Second time around.
Hello?
The second time around.
Hey, boy. Excuse me, do you know whose cat this is?
Bob came to you for a reason.
Bob?
That's what he wants you to call him.
In the past, I've screwed up every opportunity I've been given. I don't want to go that way.
Who are the
You're doing great. James,
make you
you can't take on too much too far.
I'm ready.
are any of them
I've got Bob.
standing by your side?
And look after me.
'Cause all our lives
You're keeping him, aren't you?
are just
Give it a try, help Bob and I.
here
Bob's shown me what life could be like on the other side.
like
You want to come again tomorrow?
satellite moments.
I wanted to apologise for everything.
I'm the one that needs to apologise.
Satellite moments.
Everyone gets a second chance. Luckily for me, I had a very important companion to help with my second chance. Don't look at me like that. High five.
Anyway, so it's not just as easy as kind of picking up a cat and busking and things like that. They, kind of sanitizing the experience, but at least it's it's maybe pulls at the heartstrings a bit to think about what happens when we fall out of community. What happens when we're not embraced by or encompassed by the community that we are we belong to or we regard as being home, because it's become rigid, because it's become dogmatic, or because it's become too focused on the past and too focused on its own certainties and isn't forward looking enough. And that's the experiences that we share. And this is why one of the things I think which is the most essential thing about community media is that it's a space for shared expression and shared identity, and it's a space for telling our stories and sharing our stories. And this is kind of providing the facilitated, mediated platforms to do this is the purpose of why we support community media, to go beyond those things that we're certain and sure about and to push the boundaries so that we can kind of figure out what it is that we don't know, that kind of undiscovered country, if you like. And this is what takes us into this kind of idea of otherness, and that to embrace what Zygmunt Bauman calls is, kind of we look for the promise of shelter in our culture and our community. Without that promise of shelter, we can't be confident about our identity. And where do we pick up the cues and we see the reflected expressions of identity so that we know that we're on the right track? We can't exist as atomized individuals just operating in a world by ourselves. We have to be able to share that experience with others and get feedback about it, and to bring together a sense of commonality that grows from people sharing what their experience has been. And that then becomes a kind of the Bauman calls a kind of community of sameness is definitely an insurance policy against a very fraught kind of world. But it isn't enough, because that sameness doesn't necessarily kind of answer anything, because none of us as individuals, and this is why understanding, not reflecting back on what our character is, rather than necessarily our identity is. Our identity is formed in the social realm. Our character is something that we hold on to as individuals. And we can have multiple identities, but our character is the thread that is carried through those identities. So it's almost like identity is about stripping away the artifice of our identity and stripping away those things and discovering in the process of experience and life and challenges and all the rest of it, what our character is and who we are. And that's a lifetime's journey. Unfortunately, maybe we just live in a world which is just about the expression of identity, and that can be good as well. But we've got to think about where this is pushed on and how we translate that into radio programs and videos and blogs and newspaper articles and whatever form of media expression that music, whatever poetry, whatever form of expression that we want to engage in. Right, so as ever, the notes are available with the report, with the video, and we're kind of getting through a couple of these now. So if you've got any comments or observations, it's decentered.co.uk. Instagram and Twitter is @decenteredmedia. But until next time, stay safe. And enjoy digging out all of your old records and photographs and things, or enjoy putting together an album of music and records and photographs to kind of something that you can show to people as an expression of who you are and what your character is. But anyway, I'll speak to you soon. Yeah, take care. You've been watching a Decentered Media talk with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @decenteredmedia.